The Saturday morning sun filtered through the tall windows of the Grand Hall at the New York National Junior Chess Championship, casting long golden rectangles across the polished marble floor. The venue buzzed with the quiet intensity of expectation. Rows of gleaming chess tables stood like soldiers at attention, each equipped with digital clocks and notation sheets. Parents, in tailored blazers and designer dresses, hovered near their children. Young prodigies dressed in crisp white shirts, navy vests, and polished shoes. Coaches whispered last-minute strategies. Sponsors' banners hung proudly from the rafters, the largest of them bearing the bold logo of Ford Tech Financial Group. No one noticed the small figure slipping through the side entrance. Grace Walker was 10 years old, small for her age, with dark hair tied back in a messy ponytail that had already begun to unravel. Her hoodie was faded gray, the cuffs frayed, and her sneakers were scuffed beyond recognition. She carried nothing but a worn canvas backpack slung over one shoulder. Without fanfare, she walked to the registration table, stood on her tiptoes, and placed a crumpled entry form in front of the startled volunteer. The woman behind the table blinked. "Sweetheart, are you sure this is the right place?" "The junior nationals require pre-registration, and I'm sure Grace said quietly." Her voice was soft but steady. She pointed to the form. "My name's there." "Grace Walker." The volunteer scanned the list again, frowning. "I don't see—" "Wait," she paused. "There is a blank slot, but we usually—" A man standing nearby, wiping down one of the chessboards with a cloth, looked up. Luke Walker straightened slowly. He was 38, broad-shouldered but lean from years of physical labor. His dark hair was tousled, his blue work shirt rolled to the elbows, revealing forearms marked with old scars and fresh grease stains. He stepped forward, voice low and apologetic. "I'm her father, Luke Walker. We didn't have the registration fee until last week. I paid it online yesterday. I know it's late. I just wanted her to have a chance." The volunteer hesitated, glancing toward the head organizer, who was deep in conversation with a group of sponsors. A few parents nearby exchanged looks, some curious, others dismissive. Whispers drifted over. "No coach, no uniform, who even let her in?" "She looks like she wandered in from the street." Luke kept his eyes on the volunteer. "Please, she's practiced every day. She deserves to play." After a long moment, the organizer waved a hand without looking up. "Fine. One open slot. Let her play the first round, but no special treatment." Grace didn't smile. She simply nodded once, thanked the volunteer in a small voice, and followed her father to the assigned table near the back of the hall. Luke knelt beside her as she sat down. "You okay, kiddo?" Grace adjusted the board so the black pieces faced her. "I'm okay, Dad." He brushed a stray hair from her forehead. "Just play like you do at home." "One move at a time." She met his eyes. For a second, something fierce flickered there, something far older than 10 years. Then she looked back at the board. The pairing announcement came over the speakers. Table 17, Cassandra Ford versus Grace Walker. A ripple of murmurs spread through the crowd. Cassandra Ford walked confidently to the table. 12 years old, tall for her age, blonde hair pulled into a perfect French braid, wearing the navy and gold uniform of the elite Kingston Academy chess program. Behind her, Charlotte Ford took her seat in the front row. Charlotte was 42, impeccably dressed in a charcoal blazer and silk blouse, her auburn hair swept into a low chignon. As CEO of Ford Tech Financial Group, the title sponsor of the entire event, she radiated the kind of authority that made people straighten their posture when she entered a room. She crossed her legs, glanced at her phone, then looked up at the board. Her daughter versus... that child. Charlotte's lips pressed into a thin line. She leaned toward her assistant. "Who is that girl?" The assistant checked her tablet. "No record in the advanced rankings. Walk-in entry." Father's a mechanic, apparently. Charlotte's gaze returned to the table. She watched Grace arrange the pieces with careful precision, then looked at Luke, who stood a respectful distance away, hands clasped behind his back. Something about the man, his quiet posture, the faint tension in his shoulders, made her frown deepen. The clock started. Cassandra opened with the Queen's Gambit, aggressive and textbook. She moved quickly, confidently, the way she had been trained since she was 6. Spectators nodded approvingly. This would be over in 20 moves, maybe less. Grace studied the board for a long moment. Then she responded not with the expected defense, but with an unusual pawn push, that disrupted Cassandra's center control. The crowd shifted slightly. 5 minutes in, Cassandra launched a knight fork. Grace countered with a bishop sacrifice that most adults would have hesitated to make. Gasps rippled through the hall. Luke watched from the side, arms folded, expression unreadable. Only the slight tightening of his jaw betrayed the storm inside him. At move 18, Cassandra's queen was pinned. She stared at the board, cheeks flushing. At move 23, her rook was trapped. By move 27, her king had no safe squares. Cassandra's voice cracked as she looked toward the front row. "Mom, I'm going to lose." Charlotte stood up so quickly her chair scraped against the floor. The hall fell silent. Grace moved her knight to F7. "Checkmate." The digital clock beeped. The arbiter stepped forward, raised Grace's hand. "Winner Grace Walker." For a heartbeat, no one moved. Then the murmurs exploded. Luke closed his eyes for a second, a single tear escaping before he wiped it away with the back of his hand. Grace sat perfectly still, hands folded in her lap, staring at the board as though she couldn't quite believe what she had done. Charlotte remained standing, staring at the small girl in the faded hoodie who had just dismantled her daughter's perfect game in front of hundreds of people. And in that frozen moment, the entire room understood something irreversible had begun. The silence in the grand hall lingered longer than anyone expected. The arbiter's announcement still echoed faintly from the speakers. Winner Grace Walker. The digital clock on table 17 had frozen at 27:14. Grace remained seated, hands folded neatly in her lap, staring at the board as though studying the position one last time. She did not smile. She did not pump her fist. She simply breathed slow, and even the way her father had taught her when the world felt too loud. Across from her, Cassandra Ford sat, frozen cheeks streaked with tears. The 12-year-old prodigy, who had never lost a rated game in her division, stared at the checkmated king like it had personally betrayed her. Her shoulders began to shake. A soft sob escaped, then another. One of the coaches from Kingston Academy hurried forward, placing a comforting hand on her back, but Cassandra shook her head, refusing to be led away. The murmurs started, small whispers among parents. A few sharp intakes of breath then grew into a low wave of astonishment that rolled through the room. Who is she? No coach. No academy. She beat Cassandra Ford in 27 moves. Luke Walker stood a few paces from the table, arms still folded, eyes fixed on his daughter. Only those closest to him could see the single tear track down his cheek before he brushed it away with the sleeve of his worn shirt. He did not move to comfort Grace. He knew she needed the moment to settle inside her first. Charlotte Ford remained standing in the front row posture, rigid expression unreadable. Her assistant hovered nearby, tablet in hand, already typing furiously, likely drafting a statement or damage control or both. Charlotte's gaze shifted from the board to the small girl in the faded hoodie, then to the man who had quietly claimed responsibility for her. She moved. Her heels clicked sharply against the marble as she crossed the floor. Conversations hushed around her. By the time she reached table 17, the entire hall seemed to hold its breath. She stopped directly in front of Luke. "You are the father." Her voice was calm, measured, the tone one used in boardrooms to command attention without raising volume. Luke met her eyes. He was taller than she was, even in her heels, but he did not loom. He simply nodded. "Yes, ma'am." Luke Walker. Charlotte studied him for a long second. The grease-stained hands, the faint lines of exhaustion around his eyes, the way he stood with the quiet steadiness of someone who had carried heavy things for a very long time. "You taught her to play like that." Luke gave a small, almost apologetic smile. "No, ma'am. I don't know chess the way these kids do. I just play with her. Every night after work, we use scraps of wood I cut from the shop. She figures most of it out herself." A ripple of disbelief passed through the nearby crowd. Cassandra's coach looked up sharply. "That's impossible. Those were master-level moves." The bishop sacrifice on move 19, most grandmasters would hesitate. Grace spoke then, her voice small but clear. "Dad doesn't teach like books. He tells stories." Charlotte turned her attention to the girl. Grace looked up without flinching. "Stories." Grace nodded. About soldiers. About men who had to think fast when everything was falling apart. Dad says a good move isn't always about winning right away. It's about staying alive one more turn. about seeing what the other person doesn't want you to see. The hall had gone completely quiet. Luke cleared his throat. I tell her about the men I served with, how they survived by paying attention, by being patient, by protecting what mattered. Chess. It's the same in a way. She listens. She remembers. Charlotte's expression did not change, but something flickered behind her eyes, something close to recognition, quickly masked. Before she could respond, a voice broke from the side of the crowd. Luke Walker. An older man in a faded army jacket pushed forward, gray hair, weathered face, the unmistakable bearing of a retired soldier. He stopped a few feet away, eyes wide. "Iron Ghost," he said, voice rough with emotion. "Fallujah, 2004. Bravo 9. You pulled me out of that burning Humvee. I was bleeding out. You carried me 2 blocks under fire." The words landed like a shockwave. Luke's jaw tightened. He gave a single small nod. "Sergeant Ramirez. Good to see you still walking." Ramirez's eyes filled. "I looked for you after. You disappeared. No records. Nothing. They said you were gone." "I came home," Luke said quietly. "Had a family to take care of." Grace looked from her father to the older man, confusion clouding her face. "Dad." Luke knelt beside her, voice gentle. "I didn't tell you because I didn't want those days to be who you saw when you looked at me. I wanted you to see the man who makes pancakes on Sundays, the man who loses at checkers so you can win, not the other stuff." Grace's eyes searched his. "But you were brave." Luke touched her cheek. "Being brave isn't the hard part, kiddo. Coming home and staying. That's the hard part." Ramirez wiped his eyes with the back of his hand. "You saved my life that day. And now your girl just saved my faith in what people can do with nothing but heart and a board." The older man turned to Charlotte. "Ma'am, with respect, this isn't about money or academies. This is about a father who taught his daughter how to think under fire. And she just proved it on your daughter's board." Charlotte did not respond immediately. Her gaze moved slowly from Ramirez to Luke, then back to Grace, who still sat with perfect composure, hands folded, waiting. For the first time in many years, Charlotte Ford felt something she had long trained herself to ignore: uncertainty. She looked down at the girl who had just dismantled not just a chess game, but an entire set of assumptions about who deserved to sit at the table. Then she looked at the father who had carried ghosts in silence, so his daughter could walk forward without them. The hall remained hushed, every eye on the small family and the powerful woman who suddenly seemed far less certain of her ground. Charlotte drew a slow breath. Then, in a voice so quiet only those closest could hear, she said, "I would like to speak with you both. Privately. After the next round." Luke met her gaze steadily. Grace looked up at her father, waiting for his decision. Luke nodded once. "Whenever you're ready, ma'am." And in that single agreement, the rules of the game changed forever. Charlotte Ford did not wait for the next round. She left the grand hall immediately after the private conversation request, her assistant trailing behind like a shadow. The click of her heels echoed down the marble corridor, long after she disappeared through the side exit reserved for sponsors. By the time the afternoon pairings were announced, the news had already begun to spread, first in hushed tones among the parents, then in frantic texts, and finally in the form of a single leaked photo on social media. A small girl in a faded hoodie shaking hands with the arbiter while the CEO of Ford Tech stood frozen in the background. The caption read, "Unknown girl crushes Ford heiress at Nationals. Who is Grace Walker?" By evening, the hashtag Grace Walker was trending in chess circles. By midnight, it had crossed into general news feeds. Luke and Grace left the venue quietly. He carried her backpack while she walked beside him, still silent, processing the day in her own way. In the parking lot, Luke opened the door of his old pickup truck, a faded blue Ford with a dented fender and a toolbox bolted to the bed. "You did good today, kiddo," he said, buckling her in. Grace looked up at him. "I didn't mean to make Cassandra cry." Luke paused, hand on the seatbelt. "Winning hurts sometimes, especially when you're used to it, but you played fair. That's what matters." She nodded slowly. "Dad, that man who called you Iron Ghost, was that true?" Luke started the engine. The truck rumbled to life. "Some of it. Not all stories need to be told every day." They drove home in silence, the city lights blurring past the windows. The next morning began with a phone call. Luke's phone rang at 7:12 a.m. He answered while pouring cereal for Grace. Mr. Walker. This is Principal Hayes from Lincoln Elementary. I'm afraid there's been a complaint regarding Grace's participation in the Nationals. The district has received an anonymous report questioning the validity of her entry and, well, we're required to place her on temporary suspension from all extracurricular activities pending review. Luke's hand froze on the milk carton. Suspension. For what the report claims irregularities in registration and questions whether she received unauthorized coaching. We have to follow protocol. Grace looked up from her bowl. Dad, he forced a calm tone. It's okay, sweetheart. Eat your breakfast. He stepped into the hallway. Who filed the complaint? The principal hesitated. It came through official channels. I'm not at liberty to say, but it's tied to the Ford Foundation Scholarship Program. They're major donors. Luke ended the call without another word. Less than an hour later, his boss at the garage called. Luke, listen, I hate this, but we got an inspection notice from the city building department. Full audit. Permit safety codes the works. They're coming tomorrow. I can't have you on the clock during that. I'm sorry, man. It's paid leave for now, maybe 2 weeks. Luke stared at the wall. Who requested the inspection? A long pause. It came from higher up. Look, I don't know the details, but word is it's connected to some big sponsor. Just lay low, okay? He hung up. Grace appeared in the doorway, still in her pajamas. Dad, is something wrong? He forced a smile. Just grown-up stuff. Nothing we can't handle. But inside, the anger was rising, not hot and explosive, but cold and steady. He had spent years learning how to survive under pressure. This was just another kind of battlefield. Charlotte Ford arrived at the garage that afternoon. She stepped out of a black SUV with tinted windows alone, no assistant, no security detail. She wore a simple navy coat over jeans and low heels, an attempt at blending in that still screamed money. The garage smelled of oil and metal. Mechanics glanced up, then quickly looked away. Luke was under a lifted sedan, wrench in hand. He slid out on the creeper when he heard her footsteps. He stood wiping his hands on a rag. Ms. Ford, Mr. Walker. She glanced around the small, cluttered space tools hanging on pegboards, a coffee-stained calendar on the wall. Grace's drawing of a knight, taped above the workbench. May we speak? He nodded toward the small office in the back, a cramped room with a desk, 2 folding chairs, and a flickering fluorescent light. They sat. Charlotte spoke first. I did not come here to threaten you. Luke raised an eyebrow. Then why are you here? She folded her hands on the table. Because my daughter lost. Fairly. And because the story is spreading faster than I anticipated. People are saying things about privilege, about fairness, about me. Luke leaned back. People say a lot of things. They're saying, your daughter represents something real. Something my world has forgotten. She paused. I had her entry challenged. I requested the school review. I asked for the garage inspection. Luke's expression did not change. I figured. I wanted control, she said. I always want control. When you lose it even for 27 moves, you feel exposed. Luke studied her. So you tried to take away what she earned. To make it go away. Charlotte looked down at her hands. Yes. Silence stretched between them. Then Grace's voice came from the doorway. She had slipped in quietly, holding a piece of paper. Hi, she said softly. Charlotte looked up, startled. Grace walked forward and placed the drawing on the desk. It was simple, a woman in a fancy coat sitting across from a girl at a chessboard. The woman's side was colored in sharp blues and grays. The girl's side was warm oranges and yellows. In the middle, a single orange flower. I drew this for you, Grace said. I thought maybe you were cold inside, but I think you used to be warm. Like the color orange, it's the warmest color in my box. Charlotte stared at the drawing. Her fingers trembled slightly as she touched the paper. Grace continued. I'm not mad that I can't play right now. I just think, maybe you're sad. And sad people sometimes forget how to be kind. But it's okay. You can remember. Charlotte's throat worked. She did not speak for a long moment. When she finally did, her voice was barely above a whisper. Thank you, Grace. Luke watched the exchange without interrupting. Charlotte folded the drawing carefully and placed it in her coat pocket. She stood. "I will call off the complaints," she said. "Grace will be reinstated tomorrow. I will make a statement. Publicly." Luke nodded once. "That's all we ask." Charlotte looked at him. Really looked. "You could have fought back. You could have gone to the press. You didn't. I don't fight wars. I don't need to win," Luke said. "I just protect what matters." She gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. Then she left. Outside, the SUV waited. She climbed in without looking back. Inside the garage, Grace turned to her father. "Did I do okay?" Luke pulled her into a hug. "You did more than okay, kiddo." He held her tight, feeling the steady beat of her heart against his chest. And for the first time in years, he allowed himself to believe that maybe, just maybe, the world could still be fair. Charlotte Ford did not return to her penthouse that evening. Instead, she drove herself alone in the black SUV she rarely used without a driver. The city lights blurred past as she crossed the bridge out of Manhattan, heading toward the quieter borough where Luke's garage sat on a narrow street lined with auto shops and small warehouses. She parked 2 blocks away, not wanting the vehicle to draw attention, and walked the rest of the distance in the cooling night air. The garage was closed, the bay doors pulled down, but a single light glowed in the small office window at the back. Charlotte hesitated at the chain-link fence, then pushed through the unlocked gate. Her footsteps crunched on gravel. Inside the office, Luke sat at the desk under the harsh fluorescent bulb, reviewing a stack of overdue invoices by hand. Grace was asleep on the worn couch in the corner, wrapped in an old army blanket, her chest set still open on the floor beside her as if she had fallen asleep mid-game. Luke looked up when the door creaked. He did not seem surprised. "Miss Ford," he said quietly, setting the papers down. Charlotte stood in the doorway, coat still on hands in her pockets. "I didn't call ahead. I wasn't sure you'd answer." Luke gestured to the empty folding chair across from him. "Sit," she did. For a long moment neither spoke. The only sounds were the hum of the refrigerator in the corner and Grace's soft, even breathing. Charlotte pulled the folded drawing from her coat pocket, the one Grace had given her that afternoon. She placed it on the desk between them. "I've looked at this more times today than I've looked at my quarterly report," she said. Luke glanced at the paper. The orange flower in the center seemed brighter under the light. "She's good at seeing people," he said simply. Charlotte traced the edge of the drawing with one finger. "I haven't been seen in a long time." "Not really." Luke waited. She drew a slow breath. "When I was 12, I lost a debate tournament. My father didn't speak to me for a week. My mother told me weakness was unacceptable. I decided then that I would never lose again. Not in anything. I built everything Ford Tech, the scholarships, the image, so no one could ever make me feel small again." Luke listened without interruption, but today she continued, "A 10-year-old girl in a hoodie made me feel exactly that. Small. And instead of hating her for it, I envied her. She has something I lost somewhere along the way." Luke leaned back slightly. "What's that?" "Someone who believes in her even when she fails." Charlotte looked toward the sleeping girl on the couch. "You didn't teach her to win at all costs. You taught her to survive, to be kind, to see the person across the board, not just the pieces." Luke's voice was quiet. "I learned that the hard way, in places where winning didn't mean a trophy. It meant coming home." Charlotte nodded slowly. "I read about Fallujah after Ramirez spoke. I looked up the reports. You were awarded the Silver Star. Posthumously, they said, because you vanished after discharge. No interviews, no parades." "I didn't want them," Luke said. "Medals don't pay rent. They don't buy groceries. They don't keep a little girl from asking why her mom isn't coming back." Charlotte's eyes flickered with something raw. "I'm sorry about your wife." Luke looked down at his hands. "Cancer. Quick. She was gone before we could plan anything. Grace was 6. I stopped planning after that, just started surviving. Day by day." Silence settled again. Then Charlotte reached into her coat and pulled out an envelope. She placed it on the desk beside the drawing. "Reinstatement papers for Grace. Signed by the National Committee this afternoon. I called in every favor I had. She's back in the tournament tomorrow. Full eligibility." Luke did not touch the envelope. "Thank you." Charlotte met his gaze. That's not all. I'm making a public statement. Tomorrow morning, I'll admit I requested the review, I'll explain why it was wrong, and I'll announce a new scholarship program not for elite academies, but for kids like Grace. No prerequisites, just talent and heart. Luke studied her face. Why? Because she was right, Charlotte said softly. I was cold, and I don't want to be any more. Luke nodded once. Then do it. Not for us. For you. Charlotte looked toward Grace again. The girl stirred slightly in her sleep, murmuring something unintelligible, then settled. I brought something else, Charlotte said. She reached into her bag and pulled out a small wooden chess set, hand-carved, simple, but beautifully made. It was my father's. He gave it to me when I was 8. I haven't touched it in 20 years. I thought maybe Grace would like it. Luke took the set carefully. She will. Charlotte stood. I should go. Luke rose with her. You don't have to. She paused at the door. I do. But I'll be back. Tomorrow. For the tournament. If that's all right. Luke glanced at his daughter, then back at Charlotte. She'd like that. Charlotte gave a small, genuine smile, the first one Luke had seen that wasn't calculated. Thank you, Luke, for not turning me away tonight. He nodded. Doors stay open for people who knock, she left quietly. Luke locked the door behind her, then walked over to the couch. He knelt beside Grace and brushed a strand of hair from her face. She opened her eyes halfway. Was that Mrs. Ford? Yeah, he whispered. She brought you something. Grace smiled sleepily. I knew she'd come back. Luke tucked the blanket tighter around her. Go back to sleep, kiddo. She closed her eyes again. Dad, tomorrow. Will you sit next to her in the front row? Luke's throat tightened. If she wants me to. Grace sighed contentedly. She will. He sat there a long time after she fell asleep again, watching her breathe the new chess set resting on the floor beside her old one. Outside, the city hummed on traffic sirens' distant horns. But inside the small garage office under the single flickering light, something had shifted. Not everything. Not yet. But enough. Charlotte Ford drove home that night with the drawing still in her pocket. For the first time in years, she did not check her email or review reports. She simply drove, windows cracked, letting the cool night air remind her what it felt like to breathe without armor. And somewhere in the quiet between exits, she began to remember the girl she used to be, the one who once believed that kindness was stronger than winning. Tomorrow she would say it out loud. Tomorrow she would begin again. The morning of the state finals dawned crisp and clear, the kind of autumn day that made the city feel almost hopeful. The venue had shifted to a larger auditorium in Brooklyn, bigger lights, more cameras, a live stream feed projected on screens around the room. The hashtag Grace Walker had not faded. If anything, it had grown louder, overnight. Reporters lined the entrance microphones ready. Parents whispered about the CEO apology that Charlotte Ford had promised in a brief statement released at dawn, a short video, no makeup, no power suit, just her face against a plain background. I made a mistake, she had said. I let pride override fairness. Grace Walker deserves to play. All children do. Today I correct that. The words had been shared millions of times before sunrise. Luke and Grace arrived early. He wore the same blue work shirt, sleeves rolled up, but he had ironed it the night before. Grace had on the white dress her mother had bought her years ago for a school recital, simple cotton, knee-length, with tiny embroidered flowers at the hem. She wore the silver hair clip that had once belonged to her mom, the one shaped like a small sunflower. Luke had helped her pin it in place that morning, his fingers careful as though handling something fragile and sacred. They walked through the crowd without fanfare. A few people nodded respectfully. One mother stepped forward to say thank you for what your daughter represents. Grace smiled shyly and said, "Thank you for coming." Inside the auditorium, the atmosphere was electric. Tables were arranged in a large semicircle. Grace's name was already on the bracket for the final board. Her opponent, a 13-year-old boy from Boston, ranked number 1 in his division with a coach who had trained grandmasters. Luke led Grace to her seat, then paused when he saw the front row. Charlotte Ford was already there. No blazer, no entourage, just a cream cardigan over a simple blouse, hair loose around her shoulders. She stood when they approached, hands clasped in front of her like someone unsure of her welcome. Grace saw her first back Charlotte. The girl's face lit up. She ran the last few steps and hugged Charlotte around the waist without hesitation. Charlotte stiffened for half a second. Then her arms came down, gently returning the embrace. "Good morning, Grace." Luke stopped a pace away. "You came." "I said I would." Charlotte met his eyes. "I keep my promises now." He nodded once. "Sit with us." She hesitated, then took the seat beside him. The arbiter called the finalists to their tables. Grace walked forward alone, small but steady. She sat, arranged her pieces with the same quiet precision she always used, then looked toward the front row. Luke gave her a small nod. Charlotte offered a soft smile. Before the clock started, Charlotte reached into her bag and pulled out a folded white handkerchief. She stood, walked to the edge of the playing area, and placed it beside Grace's board. Embroidered in one corner in neat orange thread were the words, "Even the Queen can be kind." Grace looked at it, then up at Charlotte. Her eyes shone. "Thank you," she whispered. Charlotte returned to her seat without a word. The game began. Grace played black's second move advantage. Her opponent opened aggressively, pushing pawns forward like an army on the march. Grace responded patiently, mirroring the lessons she had learned at home: survive first, then strike. The crowd watched in near silence. Cameras zoomed in. The live stream chat exploded with hearts and fire emojis. At move 22, Grace sacrificed her queen for position. Gasps rippled through the room. Her opponent hesitated, then took the bait. By move 31, his king was cornered. Grace moved her rook to h8. Checkmate. The clock beeped. The arbiter raised her hand. "Champion Grace Walker." The auditorium erupted. Grace stood slowly. She did not run to the crowd. She walked straight to her father first. Luke met her halfway, dropping to one knee so she could wrap her arms around his neck. "You did it," he whispered, voice thick. "All by yourself." Grace pulled back just enough to look at him. "Not by myself. With you and with her." She glanced toward Charlotte. Luke followed her gaze. Charlotte was already standing, tears on her cheeks, quiet, unashamed. She walked forward. Grace released her father and stepped into Charlotte's arms. The hug was longer this time, tighter. When they parted, Charlotte knelt to Grace's level. "I'm proud of you," she said. "Not just for winning, for being who you are." Grace smiled, the first real wide smile of the day. "I'm proud of you, too, for coming back." Charlotte laughed softly through tears. "You have no idea how much that means." Reporters surged forward, but Charlotte raised a hand. "Not now. Let them have this moment." She turned to Luke. He extended his hand. She took it, not a handshake, but a grip that lingered. "Thank you," she said, "for letting me be part of this." Luke shook his head. "You earned it." The three of them stood together as the crowd applauded father-daughter, and the woman who had once tried to erase them but now stood beside them instead. Later that evening, Charlotte's letter appeared online, handwritten, scanned, shared by her official account. It read, "I spent years building walls so no one could hurt me again. Today, a 10-year-old girl showed me that walls don't protect us, they isolate us. Grace Walker didn't just win a chess game. She won something bigger, the right to be seen, to be believed in, to be treated fairly. I was wrong to question her place at the table. I was wrong to think power means control. From now on, I choose differently. I choose kindness, I choose fairness, I choose to listen. Even the Queen can be kind." Charlotte Ford. The letter spread like wildfire, but in the small garage that night, none of them looked at their phones. Charlotte arrived just after sunset carrying a wooden box. Inside was a hand-carved chess set, simple pieces, warm walnut and maple. "I thought Grace might like it," she said, setting it on the workbench. Grace's eyes widened. "It's beautiful," Charlotte smiled. "It's yours. And if you'll have me, I'd like to come play sometimes. Not as a sponsor, just as someone who wants to learn again." Grace looked at her father. Luke nodded. "Door's always open." Charlotte stayed for coffee, real coffee brewed in an old pot on a hot plate. They sat around the workbench, Grace between them, the new set open on the table. No one spoke of empires or medals or headlines. They just played, one move at a time. Outside, the city continued its endless rhythm. Inside the garage, under the single warm bulb, three people sat together not as CEO and mechanic and prodigy, but as people who had finally found a place to rest. Not a fairy tale ending. Not perfection. Just a beginning. A quiet, honest one. And for the first time in years, all three of them felt like they were finally home.